Seth, today's a big day, buddy, and I'm so happy you've agreed to do this topic with me. But first of all, I'm gonna say Happy Friday, bro.
Happy Friday to you, man. I know this is a topic that we've been not dancing around for a while, but it feels like the subject matter here has almost been our third co-host on the podcast, and that he comes up so much. We love to reference him both seriously and as a joke. So finally, he's getting his 30 minutes due today.
It's a special day, everyone. We're talking about the voice behind the voice. This is Michael McDonald, the Michael McDonald, and we're describing the Michael McDonald effect. And why did we call that? There's a number of reasons that we're going to get into. And Seth, I know that you and I had fun, just to tell everyone a little brief story. Back in the day when we were roommates, we lived with a French guy named Kevin, our good friend and brother. And Kevin heard us listen to Michael McDonald so much that he adopted him. And Kevin loved to dance to Michael McDonald. So Kevin out there back in France, this is for you, buddy. But let's start off with the basics. Who is Michael McDonald? This is a guy born 1952, St. Louis, Missouri. And I got to say, doesn't even have that kind of rough life, this typical background of a massive rock star. He almost seems like your geometry teacher. You see him when you look at him.
Yeah, doing our research, I think one thing that struck me is the lack of controversy around Michael McDonald. So unlike some other episodes we do, which is about the debauchery of rock stars or the crazy stories behind them, there actually aren't a ton about Michael McDonald, which is, I think, fine in that it will really let us focus on kind of the musical contributions, the legacy he's left, and the legacy that's still being built. I mean, he's still collaborating with current artists who adore him. But still kind of important to lay the groundwork of where he came from. Like you said, a pretty inconspicuous Midwesterner, Scott, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. But let me just run through some basic stats. 5-time Grammy Award winner. He has had 9 studio albums, multiple top 40 hits, and collaborated with nearly your greatest legends of rock. Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin. We're getting into Kenny Loggins, Christopher Cross. So he's not only the captain of yacht rock, right? He's the captain of what they call Blue-Eyed Soul. He is parodied in I would say in a respectful way on shows like Family Guy, even the Cleveland Show. He's had a whole YouTube series that is based off of him and his yacht rock, let's say, leadership. And I found him so fascinating because he would almost be like your version, if it was good, of like Spam back in the late 70s and early 80s, where you didn't request him, but he was just there. And not like Phil Collins, where it was the lead voice. He was almost like a subliminal, like years later, you're like, I know I've heard that voice.
Yeah. He's a rare guy. We've had artists, I think we've even had a full episode on artists who were very successful with bands who then had a successful solo career. And there's no doubt that Michael McDonald has had that. But the third piece, which is unusual, is that he's been an unbelievably busy session musician, kind of singing backup on other people's songs, co-writing songs for other people. He exists both in the forefront, in the background, and off screen completely within music. And I think that is actually a very unusual career trajectory that in some cases all three are happening at the same time. So he's a busy man.
That's a great way to put it. And crossing ethnic lines. I find that incredibly unique. For example, if you go on YouTube and you type in, it has like 4 African-American guys in their 20s, and it's a reaction video to Michael McDonald. And you just see their reaction when they see his face. They thought it was a black guy. And here he is coming out with his white hair and white beard. And they're just freaking out because of how good he is. They call him like, oh man, I thought it was Marvin Gaye. And they love it. They're dancing and they're like, this is the best song ever. And that's what I find it's called this Michael McDonald effect. But where did it begin, Seth? So, give a little bit just about his stats, if you will.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, he's a guy who was born in St. Louis, fairly fairly uninteresting childhood, kind of early years. He played in a bunch of different bands across the Midwest, working, but nothing, no hits, nothing spectacular. Was discovered by an A&R guy playing with a band called Blue, I think they were called, in Illinois. So there's a little claim to fame for my current home state. And just kind of plucked him out of this band and was like, you need to come to LA. You've got a voice that like could be used. And I don't even know that there was a clear plan for him if he was going to be in a band. I think it was more of a session guy. Like, you just have a voice that belongs somewhere else besides this nightclub. And he moved out there relatively young. I think he was 21 or 22 when he up and headed to the West Coast and had success pretty quickly. I was actually surprised thinking about his heyday with the Doobie Brothers, which was, and Steely Dan, which we'll get into, early 70s. I mean, at this point, he's like 20 or 21 or 22 when he's singing on a lot of those early records. So not a lot of climb to the top, a little bit plucked out of obscurity, and then just never left. So, I mean, that was sort of the pre-fame Michael McDonald.
That's right. He was literally living in a garage, and next thing you know, he's on a car driving out to LA, auditions with Steely Dan directly for Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, the two founding members. And he said that he didn't know what to expect. Donald Fagen, he said, liked him just because he could hit these high notes. And he said that he liked that Michael McDonald sounded like a girl when he could sing at those high notes. And he says, then he got the part, backup singer for Steely Dan. And for those who know Steely Dan, they're meticulous and almost these perfectionists. So for Michael McDonald to impress these, let's say, paragons of perfection is pretty impressive. And I remember hearing an interview with Donald Fagen saying that when they were touring in those early 70s, anytime that Michael McDonald would go on and sing that very short backup sequence, the crowd would go ballistic.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of like looked and said, wait, what's going on?
It reminded me, I'll say a couple things about that. The sort of people going crazy over it reminded me of the way they talk about, and we talk about the Eagles a lot, but like Randy Meisner on Take It to the Limit, at the end, he hits the note and people lose their minds. And it's a very critical part of the live set. But I also thought it was funny. Like, I don't think of Michael McDonald as like guy who sings falsetto, right? Like that to me, I think of much more. I mean, he's a baritone. He's got this big, deep voice, so he can go really low and soulful, but then he can go up high too. So to me, it's the duality that's interesting. Not that he can hit the high notes, but to your point, I think it's interesting to know for those who, if you're a nerd listening to this show, you probably do have a sense. But after like the first or second Steely Dan album, pretty much then on, it was Fagen and Becker and just whoever they felt fit the sound at the time. So they would cycle through session musicians, and guys often didn't stick around for more than one, maybe two albums. And Michael McDonald was around starting with Katie Lied in 1975. Then he played on The Royal Scam, he played on Aja, and he played on Gaucho, which is like their, 4 or 5 biggest albums aside from Can't Buy a Thrill, which is the first one. So not only was he there for an extended period of time for a sideman in Steely Dan, but he was there for really their most not lucrative, but their most illustrious period of performance.
For sure.
So, yeah.
And iconic songs. For those who know the song Peg, they used them just on I would say 2 seconds, and I'll try to do this, Seth, where he goes, Peg. That was it. Peg, coming back to Peg. But it's just that. And it's absolutely incredible because it is like the ultimate accent or spice. Like, put this little thing in and it's going to change the entire dish.
Totally. There's a very funny video. Sorry to cut you off. There's a very funny video. Is SCTV, which is like the Canadian Saturday Night Live from the 70s. There's a skit with him played by Rick Moranis. Shout out to all you Honey I Shrunk the Kids fans. And he basically, it's the Christopher Cross song. What's the song, Scott, that he sings on?
Is it Ride Like the Wind?
Yeah, Ride Like the Wind. And it's the beginning is all the Christopher Cross part, and you see Michael McDonald driving his car furiously through the streets to the studio. He pulls up, barely parks it, runs into the studio, sings his one line, and then he kind of like casually walks out, like signs the contract and leaves. It's really funny just to point out, like, this is his only job. He shows up, does it, and he's good to go. If you
Yeah.
look up just Second City Michael McDonald sketch, it's actually really funny.
Oh
So
yeah. I
it
mean, you
hits the nail on the
had,
head.
for example, Family Guy does it where they basically parody Michael McDonald. So anytime that Peter says something, Michael would just repeat it in his way, like, "Hey, let's go grab a beer. Let's go grab a beer." And so it's that
Yeah.
ultimate backup, and it's just hilarious. And even when Cleveland on the Cleveland show, when so it's just a voice that's not ridiculous. As you said, mentioned, Seth, it's almost simultaneous of this falsetto and baritone that makes it so unique. Uh, so following Steely Dan, he goes into Doobie Brothers, and this completely changed the band, right? This is similar to almost like a Genesis, where the Phil Collins was the drummer, and then he comes, to the front of the stage to be the front man. This is where they hired Michael McDonald just to be a backup keyboardist, comes in or backup member, and then his songs just go off the charts, taking it to the streets, just a landmark hit. And then all of a sudden it's the Michael McDonald show, and they're insanely successful in this second act. And I mean, I really think it did save the Doobie Brothers. And then from there, as I mentioned, this is where that yacht rock really started to say, this is where all those people, everyone listens, go, oh my God, I know that Christopher Cross song, or I know that Kenny Loggins song. But he also started to do crossovers. So for example, What a Fool Believes, which, Seth, I got to say, is one of the greatest songs ever written. Co-wrote that with Kenny Loggins. Aretha Franklin does a version immediately, almost simultaneously. The song came out in 1979. Aretha releases it in 1980, a year later, as it won Album of the Year, the Minute by Minute, which was the song was featured on that album. And
Yeah.
so this is when he is just omnipresent.
Yeah, and I think you make an astute point that his entrance into the band changes the band completely. And you could argue that, that they probably needed to evolve a bit in the early mid 70s. They were a lot more kind of straight rocky. Like, I love the album What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits. It's great, but it's a totally different sound. And then once Michael McDonald enters the band, they've got much more of a soul feel. That probably extended their career another 5 to 8 years, and they just moved him again from the background right to the front. And he was both he made the music sound different, but he was also all of a sudden a contributing songwriter. So he's bringing his own songs to the mix that are very different stylistically, but are proving really popular.
Yeah, and one of the things that I heard about and saw with interviews with, for example, other members of the Doobies, is that Michael McDonald actually was, I won't say passive aggressive, but he definitely had a self-confidence and a vision for how the sound should go. And as his popularity grew, his confidence grew and his leverage, if you could say. So one of the, I'd say, rubs with some of the other Doobie Brothers fans and members was like, hey man, we're losing our rock roots. This is sounding like a Steely Dan. And but this is what Michael McDonald essentially won the power struggle. Said, hey man, people like this. This is where we're going. So he does have that, I won't say that gentle kind of aura about him, almost like a teddy bear or this kind of friendly guy, if you will. But apparently he definitely dude knew what he was doing. Like, he had a clear vision.
And it's interesting because he pops up in so many songs, but he's also so unmistakable. So unless you're really hiding him in the background, like on Ride with the Wind or all these other songs, he's sang with Toto, all these other great 70s, 80s bands. If you put him on lead vocals, it's gonna change the sound of your band. There's no, to me, that's not even passive aggressiveness, although I hear what you mean. But it's like, that's a choice the band makes as a whole to pivot their sound and kind of build it around him, right? Like he is now, he goes from being a guy you bring in to be in the background to the cornerstone of your sound. And I think that, again, that was a financially astute decision by the band to put him in front.
It's amazing to see. I watched a concert on YouTube, is 1977 with the Doobie Brothers in Chicago. And the band members are doing great. Everyone's clapping. But when Michael McDonald takes the front of the stage, people just lose it. There's something about him. I think his aura, his presence. Not only is he good technically and whatnot, but there's just something about him that people like. And I think
Yeah.
it must be hard to be a band member and to go, oh, geez, oh, here it goes. Here comes Michael.
I think
Says
he's a
one
little
word.
bit. I think he's a little bit unexpected.
Yeah.
Like we even talked about the the reaction video in the beginning. He's kind of this like schlubby-ish. What he's always had the same. Although his changes look a little bit these days, but for many years, almost like kind of this floppy bowl cut and a beard, like just unassuming, like truck drive looking dude who has this crazy voice that it doesn't look like it should be coming out of that person.
Yeah.
And so I think when you have that person come to the front and really belt it, it's striking, and that's what it brings a very visceral reaction out of people.
Definitely visceral. And there's these. I encourage everyone to go to YouTube and type in Michael McDonald reaction videos, and as again, especially from different parts of America or different backgrounds, and these guys could not believe he was white. Like, it was hilarious to see, but also shows you the range and the depth of his abilities to appeal to that, he'd say to the white guy who likes Dave Matthews Band, to someone who's into hip hop music. And you saw this especially with the 90s or the early 80s hit, I Keep Forgetting, which has that indelible bass line that Warren G and Nate Dogg used for Regulate in the 90s, which is the pinnacle of this kind of G-funk rap that used his song almost as it, like when P. Diddy used the Police with Every Breath You Take, literally.
And also hit his stride as a solo artist, like with like the Doobie Brothers officially dissolved in 82, the same year this first solo album came out that had I Keep Forgetting on it. So my guess is he was probably stockpiling this material. Maybe it even would have popped up on a Doobie Brothers album later. But I Keep Forgetting came pretty fast and furious, with like right after the Doobie Brothers, like he stepped away and became a solo artist. So he was ready to go. And like you said, has a very early 80s, like almost this like haunting, the keyboard with the deep bass. Like it sounds very of its time.
Yeah.
You can almost like see the smoke machine when you hear it, but it's also timeless, as is evidenced by the fact that it was, sampled basically a decade later on a hugely popular song that I think many hip hop fans now still love and has like history of its own, and then are surprised to learn, like they'll hear the original song in the radio and be caught off guard because they really didn't change it at all, like at all.
Yeah.
Aside from actually rapping over it, I mean, it's not slowed up or sped down or hidden in the background. It's the whole song, and so a song so good it was a hit twice, completely different. So
why, Seth, do you think he's still relevant? Because there's many artists that have been even more successful in terms of number of awards and albums sold. For example, take a Kenny Loggins, and we talked about Kenny, who's the king of soundtracks, but somehow Michael McDonald seems to be still relevant, still prevalent, still talked about. And obviously still touring and whatnot. But just for example, my little cousin who lived with us briefly was so into yacht rock, and maybe that had a play into it, but that genre of music seems to have some resurgence, which brings back Michael McDonald. But he's still desirable, like in terms of, he's not like, oh, that's a vintage sound, that's cool, and we don't want to really hear it anymore.
Yeah, I think he's a couple things. I think he's such a unique voice that he's got this sort of nostalgic hook for people where you hear it and it brings you back, even if you don't know exactly who you're hearing. Yeah. I think Blue-Eyed Soul as a genre, which you could probably qualify if you had to pick one description of his voice, I think kind of like Steve Winwood, even though Steve Winwood did a lot of stuff, he's really at his core a blue-eyed soul singer. So I think that makes him relatively universal. I think the fact that he's touched so many genres over so many years, playing with bands that are also equally loved and nostalgic for people. All and the fact that he's just, like you said, still playing shows, still kind of, I think, winkingly self-aware at his yacht rock kind of internet personality, and still playing like yacht rock. I know he headlighted, literally it was called like Yacht Rock Review or something.
Yeah.
At the Hollywood Bowl a few years ago. So he's still playing. All his songs are still on the radio. Go to CVS and you'll probably hear a Michael McDonald song. So it's still like culturally relevant. And then he's been able to reinvent himself. So we should be, you know, he had a hugely successful, like kind of like proper first solo career with duets with people like Patti LaBelle, with solo albums. Joined the New York Rock and Soul Review with Donald Fagen, Boz Scaggs, Phoebe Snow, people like that. So he's constantly reinventing. He knows how to deploy his talent. He's not necessarily reinventing himself, but he's allowing himself to sort of collaborate with a lot of different people that keep his sound and brand relevant right up until, like, you know, we'll get into it, but the early 2000s, he puts out these Motown cover records that all of a sudden are everywhere again. Where which pops in, you know, we'll talk about it, but in 40-Year-Old Virgin, like, even pops up there. He's become what he's not quite an institution in the way, like, I don't know, like Elvis would be an institution, but he is pretty omnipresent musically in our lives in America today.
And I will say, I have to say, he's a little cooler than Phil Collins, who many say is omnipresent as well. And I think
he's still got a great head of hair. That helps too.
I think there's something. I remember, as I mentioned, that concert in the late 70s, because he was wearing a sport coat. You have the Doobie Brothers, and they got their they almost have the throwback to that late 60s. And he comes out and he looks like a professor, almost with the, you know, the padded elbows and whatnot. And I thought that was almost so rock and roll. There was something really honest about it and unpretentious. And maybe it's that Midwest spirit of very likable, very honest, very self-spoken, but just talent that blew everyone away. Literally.
Yeah. I don't think anything about him is trying to be cool. You know what I mean? I think he's pretty unapologetically himself, and he sort of lets his voice, and it's really not even, I mean, I think he's a reasonably good keyboardist, but you never hear people be like, you got to hear Michael McDonald's keyboard on the song. He knows where his bread is buttered, and that's his voice. He's not trying to be anybody he's not. And I think that he has never really needed to reinvent his physical image, because his voice has allowed him to reinvent and slide in between genres pretty easily on its own.
Yeah, he's like the ultimate American product of just like an amalgamation of the different kind of influences from R&B to jazz. And I think that is just very unique. Like, all the stars aligned for this special voice. But Seth, what would you like to see him collaborate on? You know, he's collaborated with all these artists. And one that I just want to point out, let me just say, he collaborated with Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth on All Wait on the 1984 iconic album from Van Halen. I just want people to know that. He co-wrote it.
He was, I was going to say, one of the principal songwriters on it. So that's what I'm talking about. He's even a guy behind the scenes. I mean, he's writing songs for the Doobies. He's writing songs for people like that. He co-wrote songs with Toto. He's a frequent collaborator with Kenny Loggins, as we mentioned, another sort of like very much omnipresent person from the 80s, and another frequent guy you hear in CVS as well. So he definitely knows his lane. In terms of what I want him to hear him do next, I mean, I don't know. I love the avenue of him just falling into, like, I'm gonna pop up as a background singer with bands that you love to already listen to. I mean, he played with, if you know who Thundercat is, kind of a, you know, solo artist, but who plays a 8-string bass, I want to say, but kind of is a little more like, you know, funk oriented, and has performed multiple times live with Thundercat and co-wrote music with him. So he's very capable of reinventing himself, kind of by like letting his voice be his guide to who the next collaborator is. It's his sound is timeless. It's just a matter of plugging in with the right people at the right time on the calendar. Yeah. How about you?
You know, I'd like to see him go international. I would love to see like a city pop Tokyo act combine Michael McDonald. So I want to take him as
some of these songs sound pretty city popish already. Some of those early 80s.
Something where he's almost as American export. And let's see how he does with like reggaeton. So if you took the best of the world and say, all right, we're going to do a mix with Michael McDonald. I think that could be, and in multilingual, right? So it doesn't all have to be in English. I'm not saying Michael McDonald should sing Spanish. I don't know.
Hey, you could go full Ronstadt and just do a full Spanish album. Yeah.
Who knows? I mean, this guy's such a genius. He could probably do a whole mariachi album.
I would support it. I mean, truly, I think it's such an interesting voice that I would, as a music fan, be curious to hear anything he decided to do without being cheesy about it. Like,
Yeah.
I think it adds a unique layer to almost any context that it's brought into. So
Yeah.
it is as jokey as it sounds. It's like, well, record it first and let me hear it before we goof on it, right? The only thing that's I think it's let's talk a little bit about the legacy of him as a pop cultural figure, because I think no one knows much about him. I mean, like, he's been married to the same woman since '83, never caused waves,
No
like
drama.
lived pretty quietly. I mean, you kind of know what his voice sounds like, speaking voice, but not really. He's pretty unassuming. So I think he's also okay. So we got kind of very specific looking guy with a very unique voice and no other personality traits that are super well known or negative either way. So it's almost like a blank canvas on which you can paint a parody, right? So I think that's why he's been so ripe for Family Guy parodies. And so, like, he's been kind of a joke for 30 years, but that's not the right way to describe it. It's like it's such a unique force that you have to kind of play with it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
It's not making fun of him. It's like the absurdity of kind of who he is, and you can make him anything you want because he's a blank slate. I think that's kind of unique for someone who's been so popular and famous by name, at least for a long time.
I totally agree. And I love how the younger artists embrace him as well and recognize him. There was the Jimmy Fallon show where they invited Justin Timberlake and Michael McDonald, and they did a rendition of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. And it was, how do I say it? It was out of affection and out of respect. So it was funny, right? Row, row, row your boat. And even the Family Guy parody, it harkens, or it pays tribute to his talent in a funny way. So that's why I say it wasn't mean or looking at it like he's a joke, or I think it's recognizing that, hey, he's so talented and he's just everywhere. He's just so good. You got to make fun of it.
Yeah. And once again, I think it helps that he's in on the joke a little bit. There's no question that he's aware of what people perceive him as. You know what I mean? He's always winking at it. That's the sense I get, is that he doesn't take the parody personally at all. I think he knows that people are doing it in a loving way.
Yeah.
And he's never come off as like surly to me that all these people are kind of goofing on him. I think that he likes being the patron saint of yacht rock, right? I mean, it's been good for his for his ticket sales, certainly.
his wallet. Well, I think there's, you and I having a product development background, I think there's so many opportunities and missed opportunities. One I was thinking about, like Alexa, right? Amazon's Alexa. What if you did a Michael McDonald version?
Oh yeah, I would do Waze to have him give you directions in the car.
I mean, that again, we started saying there's a Michael McDonald effect. One thing we haven't seen, and maybe he's been the one to tell his agent, like, do not over license my voice, but it's almost this global symbol, right? It's almost like a friend you've always had for your life, like a fatherly figure, or this omnipresent voice, right? Almost akin to like Paul McCartney, how most of the world knows Paul McCartney's singing voice.
And it's funny, we talked about with the videos earlier with, like, is this Marvin Gaye? In my mind, there's no mistaking Michael McDonald's voice in anything he's done. I think you can. And I remember, even as I started really kind of going deeper on music in let's call it my late teens, you almost get like a Michael McDonald radar in your brain. Like, he's on so much stuff across so many popular songs that you start to hear like, oh, there he is. You know what I mean? And it's unmistakable. No one sounds like him. Which is a cool place to be. It makes you sort of a one of one, a pretty valuable commodity as a studio musician.
So Seth, as we wrap up here, what would be your song to play to someone who didn't know Michael? If there's anyone in the world that doesn't know who he is, what would you play for them?
I think it's What a Fool Believes. I don't know if that's yours. I don't want to take it, but it's like very of the time, really showcases it. He's singing low, he's singing high. And it's his penmanship, right? He wrote the
Yeah.
song too. So I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of what I think of him. Or the only one would be like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, which he performed on that Motown record later, which
Yeah.
is really just like late period McDonald at his best. So what would yours be?
It's a tie. One taking it to the streets, the other because the message. I think it has a
True.
beautiful, beautiful message. And the other is, yeah, What a Fool Believes. To me, that's almost a near perfect pop song that displayed like the doobie bounce. It had it's so uplifting, and it was able to be covered by so many artists. As I mentioned, Aretha Franklin, but so many DJs have remixed it. It can go everywhere. And on our promos, we'll definitely throw some of those clips in. But so everyone has. So Seth, how do we say goodbye in the best Michael McDonald voice? Ah!
Every weekend, everybody.
At the pool. Oh man, everyone, listen. Thank you so much. He's out there. You'll probably hear him today on your way to CVS, going to Walgreens. Michael McDonald is everywhere.
It's gonna be sunny. Grab some sunscreen and hear your man in the store.
Everyone have a good weekend. We'll see you next week.
All right, see ya.
Yep.